This is lecture 16. After glacial erosion and transportation, we are now talking about glacial deposition. And glacial deposition both concerns landforms and the sediments that are deposited, which is, by the way, not always till. On this first slide, you can already see one of the characteristics of glacial deposition, which basically means that when a glacier flows, it will either make the landforms go with the direction of the ice flow or transverse to the ice flow. So once you know that, you can then reconstruct what the glacier or the ice sheet was doing. Here you see a geological block diagram indicating some of the depositional landforms and sediments that we will talk about in this lecture. What you will also see is the position relative to the ice sheet is of prime importance, and what we will mostly talk about in this lecture is subglacial and ice marginal landforms. On this block diagram, I also want to indicate some of the factors that are important if you interpret these landforms and these sediments. One of these is the glacier or the ice sheet itself. Another one is the sediments. A third one is the location relative to the ice margin. And the final one is time. In terms of the ice sheet itself, what's important is the size of it, which we can indicate with thickness, how fast it's flowing, the ice flow velocity, whether the glacier is polythermal, temperate, or polar, so the thermal regime, whether the ice is in the advance or the retreat phase, how long it is in a certain position, and whether there is actually some supraglacial or subglacial meltwater, and whether the ice is land terminating or marine terminating, or whether it ends in a lake like you can see here. In terms of sediments, what's important is whether there are sediments, so the availability of the sediments, whether they were transported by the ice itself, so at the till, or whether these sediments are pre-glacially deposited. They could be like marine seabed sediments that are deformed by the ice and then they become glacial tectonites. What is also important in terms of the sediments is the characteristics of them, so the grain size and whether they're mixed or not. In terms of interpreting the landforms, what you can actually see here is there is a large area that is subglacially deposited. That's a till layer here. I would call it till. It may be a mixture of till and glacial tectonites. What you see at the Canadian prairies is that this till layer is about 20 meters thick in places. But on the edge of the ice sheet, whether that's the terminal moraine or a recessional moraine, some of that till material is pushed up in the ridges that we actually call moraines. So this location, whether it is underneath the ice marginal or proglacial, is really important in terms of landform formation. The final factor was time, and in terms of time, what is important, whether you only had one glaciation here or whether one glaciation deposited sediments and made landforms, and then the next time an ice sheet goes over, it may destroy the landforms but still have the sediments remaining. In the next couple of slides, I will show you examples of typical subglacial bedforms or landforms. Subglacial bedforms or landforms are the generic term of this whole range of longitudinal and transform landforms that are produced at the base of a glacier, but the glacier is usually in either fast or slow motion. So these landforms most of the time do not occur on their own. Once you find one, you actually can find hundreds or thousands of these. And the collection of these are called fields or swarms of these landforms. So often even though I actually indicate these landforms as separate landforms in this lecture, they occur either next to each other or even on top of each other in conjunction with each other. Remember that on the last slide I talked about time, so you could have a deposition of drumlins that go one direction superimposed by drumlins that go into a different direction, which may have been formed 1,000 years separate from each other. Finally, even though I'm talking about individual landforms in the next slides, classification is a human weakness, so subglacial bed forms are actually a continuum and not strict distinct classes. Drumlins. Drumlins are oval-shaped hills that are mainly composed of till. Sometimes they have a rock core, sometimes they have some stratified sediment, but you won't be able to see that on the outside of the landform. You have to dig into it to actually see the sediments. These hills can range from a couple of meters long to a few kilometers long and usually are 50 to 100 meters high. So they're longer than they're wide, and they're always aligned in the direction of ice flow. And we can see where the upstream side is because that's the blunt side, and the downstream side is a little narrower. So think about a fish with a blunt upstream side and then the narrower till side. So what we know from these landforms is that they usually or always form in areas of fast flow. So in terms of ice sheets, if you have an ice stream, you usually had a land-based ice stream, at least, had fields or swarms of hundreds or thousands of drumlins underneath, and we can exactly reconstruct the direction of that flowing ice stream. There have been a lot of debates about the formation of these drumlins, but what we know is the main genetic process is actually from subglacial deformation. So the till underneath an ice sheet may deform a little bit like toothpaste when it's really wet and under a lot of pressure. And once an area encounters some resistance, it may actually build up some sediment, or it will actually deform into a hill like this. So some of that resistance could come from an initial little bedrock hump, but sometimes it also comes from sticky spots, so frozen parts that are frozen to the bed. This is an example of a typical drumlin with a blunt upstream side and a narrower tail side, so you know that the former ice flow was actually from the bottom right to the top left. And this is a typical size, a couple of 100 meters long, maybe 50 meters high. This is actually a landform that you can see when you drive from Calgary to the Rocky Mountains. There are some drumlin fields that you can encounter of about this size. What you see in the bottom left here is an air photo of northern Canada with a swarm of drumlins that we can actually see that are interspersed with post-glacial lakes that have actually filled up this terrain. So each drumlin, you can actually see here one drumlin and here another drumlin, and clearly you can actually see that this region, for this region, the ice flow was actually from the top right to the bottom left. So here you see a typical side view of a drumlin with the upstream side on this side and the downstream side on this side, usually a couple of tens of meters high. From this image, obviously you cannot see whether the drumlin is rock cored or what the sediment stratification is. So we always have to look at the sediments and the landforms in conjunction with each other. So mostly quaternary geologists will actually dig into here or find an outcrop where maybe a road is being made through these drumlin fields, and then they can find the typical composition of these drumlins. Flutes or fluid moraines are very long, elongated, streamlined sediment ridges where the length of this landform is much longer than the width. So all these flutes are also, just like drumlins, aligned in the direction of ice flow and often occur with hundreds or thousands of these flutes next to each other. The smallest type is a little bit smaller than drumlin, so maybe tens of centimeters tall or even long, and maybe tens of meters in length. So these are usually not many kilometers long. Therefore, because they're quite a bit smaller, they're best observed from the ground, so it's harder from satellite imagery or from air photos to see these. And sometimes these landforms are actually occurring behind a rock obstacle. So in this example, what you see here, there's still ice present here. This is in Iceland or Svalbard, I believe. And the ice flow was from this direction to this direction, and you have a little bit of a till behind this rock obstacle. So on the right photo here, what you can see is a good conjunction of two different landforms next to each other. A flute, which is very straight, and then you have this meandering ridge, which could, for example, be an esker. And then you also see these two landforms, the meandering ridge and the fluting, is roughly parallel to the ice flow direction. But you can also see a landform here that goes across, it slices across, and that's actually a crevasse-filled ridge, which was a bottom crevasse that then was filled with some of the till that was squeezing upwards into this open crevasse at the bottom. Crag and tails. So now we're moving into the larger landforms, and crag and tails have a very large bedrock hill on the upstream side, and then a tail that is either also bedrock but softer type bedrock, or the tail could be sediments that were protected by this bedrock hump from erosion, whereas all the sediments around the crag have been eroded away to kind of a base level. So sometimes the crag itself is like a volcanic core. So this happens when the pre-glacial kind of geological condition was a field of like old volcanoes, and the cores of the volcanoes have harder bedrock than the surrounding sediments. So the crag is then that volcanic kind of core. So obviously, again, like we cannot actually see from the landform itself whether the tail is sediment or whether it's bedrock, so you have to dig into it. So crag and tails always have the crag at the front and the tail at the back side, so the downstream side, and they only form under ice sheets that were actually sliding. So we know that this ice sheet was at the pressure melting point. A prime example of a crag and tail that has been used by humans is the Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, so in the northern United Kingdom, where the castle was actually built on the crag, and the Royal Mile that's actually leading up to the castle from the town side to the castle is a tail of softer limestone. So here we can actually see that the crag is a couple of 100 meters, well, it's 130 meters high, whereas the town side is about 35 meters above sea level. Next landform is the ribbed moraine or the Roken moraine, and this is one example of a number of moraines that are formed underneath an ice sheet that are transverse to the ice flow. So ribbed moraines are assemblages of parallel, very closely spaced ridges that are usually very sharp crested, so the peak is quite sharp, and they're mostly composed of till, but some bedrock blocks and other sediments may be in there too. They're they're in particular clusters that are really close to the former ice divides of glaciers. So on the inside part of the ice sheets, and the formation is a little bit uncertain, but the main theory that is like most likely the theory of formation of these rogue moraines is that they form at the transition of a frozen bed to a non-frozen, a thawed bed. So there's extensional flow in the thawed bed where sliding is possible, whereas there was no sliding possible over the frozen bed. So what you see here on the maps is some map of the Laurentide ice sheet here and some map of the Scandinavian ice sheet here, and here's the Laurentide again. And the locations where we find these Rogan moraines or the rib moraines are just outside the frozen centers of the ice sheets. So here's another region, and you can see in the legend what the Rogan or red moraine region is. And those are the regions that go from where there was like no glacial erosion in the centers of these ice sheets, partly because they were frozen to the bed and partly because there was hardly any ice motion there, to slightly faster ice flow where the red moraines were forming. And outside these regions, so here in this zone from here to here, we may have drumlin fields or crag and tail fields or flutes in locations either next to each other or in specific zones. The largest subglacial landforms are called mega-scale glacial lineations, or MSGL, and they're elongated ridge furrow assemblages. So what you see here is there's two ridges here. Sorry, that's not straight lines. With a kind of a furrow in between, so a lower region in between. And all these regions are soft bed sediment deformation. So these are in a way similar to drumlins, and they're like occurring in like swarms or fields with thousands of these together. But they're typically like 5 to 100 kilometers long, so they're very large areas. They're only occurring in areas where the ice sheet was streaming, so under ice streams, indicating very fast flow. And one of the characteristics is they actually are a little bit wider on the upstream side than on the downstream side. So what you see here is not just an effect of perspective, but that's really, if you measure it in the field, it's like that. So they're found in many different regions, including under the present West Antarctic ice sheet, where there's, as you know, very fast ice streaming possible. Here you see a map of mega-scale glacial lineations around the current Antarctic Peninsula. So during the last ice age, the Antarctic ice sheet was much larger than today. But it still had ice streams in approximately the same locations as we have today. So now we can sail around with ships in those deglaciated areas and map the sea bottom. So these bathymetric maps can actually reveal these convergent, really long mega-scale glacial lineations as indications of former locations of the ice stream. Here you see a satellite image of the mega-scale glacial lineations in northern Canada, and I use this image as the cover of this particular lecture, so now you can recognize the landform in it. So the mega-scale glacial lineations here are about 100 meters wide, and they're 100 meters spaced, and these that you see here are about 20 kilometers long. The former ice flow was from the right to the left side of the image, and you can actually see that they're slightly curved. So this is actually the former ice stream was actually slightly curved to the kind of top left side of the image here. So now we transition from the morainic type landforms to fluvial glacial landforms. And so the first example is an esker. Well, you all know what eskers are from your previous lectures. So eskers are the filled R channels, the Reutlitsberger's channels. And eskers are typically identified because they're very sinuous, and sometimes they're even dendritic. So you can see the former subglacial drainage system in them. The type of sediments that eskers are composed of are mostly sands and gravels, and there's a good example of one of these eskers near Claresholm. If you actually drive from Lethbridge to Calgary and you take Highway 520, you go through an area where you transition through one of these eskers, and one of the farmers has actually made a gravel pit in this landform. So you cannot actually do this with megascale lineations, with flutes, or with drumlins, for example, because those are composed of till. So this is stratified sands and gravels. So this is handy for people to use. So eskers are still like roughly parallel to the ice flow, so that's what the direction of the R channel was. And eskers can be very small to very large. We have measured in Canada eskers up to about 800 kilometers long, but most of them are maybe up to a couple of 100 meters or even less in length. Here you see a drawing of a conceptual model of the formation of eskers, and what you need to take away from this is that the size of an esker is dependent on the sediment supply, the meltwater supply, the channel spacing of the R channels, and the retreat rate of the glacier, and each of these can actually vary through time. So what you see here is sediment supply. Obviously, like the further down glacier you go, the sediment supply goes up, but at the same time the meltwater runoff also goes up. So if you have a diminishing water flow in your channels, you may actually have more deposition of these sediments in these channels, and they actually can then fill up like almost the entire R channel. So this part is still water filled with sediments, but the part A is kind of the deposition of your esker already. And eventually what you can also have is that these channels may actually vary in position. As you can see here, sometimes these channels are kind of filled from the side here by more sediments, for example. So usually what you see is near the edge of ice streams, we have very large eskers, and then if you go further upstream, the eskers are getting smaller and smaller and smaller up to the point where you can actually see that that is perhaps where the R channel started. So now we go from the subglacial landforms to the ice marginal and the proglacial landforms. Ice marginal moraines form obviously at the margin of the glacier, so they're easier to study because we can actually see it at present still. So what you can see here is an example of a glacier in Iceland with recessional moraines, curved moraines that indicate each year where the winter is a little bit of a stagnation or perhaps even an advance, where the till or proglacial sediment is being pushed up into a ridge, and then in the summer you have the further retreat, and then the next winter a little bit of a stagnation. So time plays a role in here. So obviously terminal or end moraines or just marginal moraines in general, are always ridges that transform to ice flows and not parallel to ice flow, and they're curved just a little bit like you actually did in your analog glacial models when you actually introduced the colors in it. You can actually see that this particular glacier is flowing faster in the center than on the sides. When an ice sheet is really active and pushing all the sediments in front of it into like really large ridges, some of these moraines form ridges that actually have faults and a lot of folds in them, and they can almost be seen as like small mountain ranges, and we call these moraines thrust moraines. So thrust moraines, in terms of the location and the general arcuate shape of it, they may look the same as these recessional moraines, but because there was very active, faster flowing ice, so in the advanced phase of the either an ice age or even in a little ice age, small glaciers may do this. So what I've explained in class, many classes before, is if you take a sheet, for example, and you push, like this is a bed sheet, and you push on both sides, what you have eventually is the bed sheet is folded like this, and the distance between the beginning and the end is shorter. So what you actually see here in these thrust moraines, there's shortening going on. So the stacking up, because there's shortening going on, it's stacking up the previous sediments on top of each other, almost like the row of pancakes that I also indicated in class. So we don't actually have these moraines in southern Alberta much, because we were actually at the end phase of the glaciation where there was not very active ice flow. So we actually encountered the next type of moraines in our region. If an ice margin is stagnant, so if it's melting in place, then there may still be a lot of sediment available, and some of that is partly frozen, and you have the sediment just kind of increasing and increasing on top. And what you end up with is just a great big mass of melting ice with kind of humps and ridges. So eventually you end up with a hummocky moraine type. And here you see an example of hummocky moraines after all the ice has melted. So from this, it's quite hard to actually detect the ice flow direction. So they're quite chaotically arranged, even though the ridge complex as a whole may actually still have that arcuate form on the edge of like one of the ice tongues of the ice sheets. What you also often see in these hummocky moraine complexes is that the lower regions are actually filled up initially with ice blocks that may actually melt in place here, but they're sometimes filled up with lakes. So you may actually have stratified lake bed sediments that are surrounded by like till, that is unsorted sediments.